All right, here we are, 6:30. Um, so we're turning the final corner on the semester here. It's sort of incredible for me to think that we're already at the second last class. Um, and so what I want to do with this class and the next one, today in a more structured way and next week in a less structured way, is just troubleshoot your papers. Make sure that you're well prepared to write them, that you know what you need to do, that if you have any kinds of questions or complications, that you have a chance to ask me about them. And so with that in mind, I'm going to start with excuse me, with some troubleshooting tips. Everyone can see my slides okay here?
Yes.
Awesome. Excellent. Okay. So part of this is what I put together after reading through the proposals, and part of it is just anticipating things that might come up during the writing process. And then the rest of it is just trying to kind of give you a guide to make the transition from having done your research, your interviews, to writing up the paper. Um, I suspect that very few of you, maybe none of you, has ever done a project where you're writing about your own research. And so this is kind of a unique opportunity to figure out what that looks like. And so let me start by just saying um, a, a word about two things. One is that on the whole, I'm really excited to read your papers because of what I saw in the proposals. There are some really interesting projects that many of you have thought up, and you have entirely feasible ways of doing them. And so I'm interested. I'm looking forward to getting your papers. Um, so that was thing number one. Now, what do you think thing number two was? I can't believe I'm only 2 minutes into the class and I'm already forgetting things. Um, well, hopefully it will come back to me. Okay. So troubleshooting essay writing. This is what I want to really get to today. Um, I'm going to start off with some things that came up not in all of the papers by any stretch of the imagination, but they came up in some, and in the proposals, I'm sorry. And I want to make sure to sort of get ahead of them now, because they can become a real problem in the final paper. Oh, and now I've remembered the other thing that I wanted to say. So one of the things that I was trying out with this course is giving you the opportunity to be creators of knowledge, basically. So you're doing projects based on interviews that probably nobody has ever done before, right? Like probably nobody has interviewed the people who you've interviewed about the things that you're interviewing them on. And so when you write your papers, you actually have a kind of expertise that other people don't have because other people haven't done this work. So I hope that you find that as interesting and compelling as I do. So I'm going to go with that presumption that that's as interesting for you as it is for me. But I want to just sort of plant that particular flag and make sure that you recognize that the work that you're doing is completely unique. You're not doing work that's just about reading what other people have to say and then summarizing what other people have had to say about whatever. You're creating knowledge yourselves, and that I think is pretty great. So The thing is now how to make sure when you write your papers that you're writing the strongest possible papers. And so I want to try and get through a few of these things that come up frequently that can just get in the way of communicating as fully and clearly as you could be. Now, to that end, I've also put on Blackboard some guides for writing that talk about the particular kinds of things that are coming up here. So if you're going to write your paper and you're thinking, I can't remember what Selby had to say about sentence fragments or run-on sentences, there's a guide on Blackboard now that has fantastic explanations of these things and how to fix them. Okay, so let's start with passive voice. So I want you to compare these two sentences, right? The sentence one is Red here in the red t-shirt because I'm not very original with names. Red's partner hit him with her racket. Okay, in that case, you know exactly who was doing what to whom, right? You know who the actor is, the one who's active in the sentence. That's Red's partner. She's doing the action. You know who, you know what the action was, and you know who the recipient of that action was. Everything is clear. Great. So that is an example of the active voice. The passive voice is the following sentence. Red was hit by a racket. In that sentence, we don't know who the actor is, right? We know that things went badly for Red, but we don't know who was the agent that made things go badly. And that's the problem with writing in the passive voice, is that you don't know who the actor is. And for some disciplines, writing that way is completely fine. But for sociology and anthropology, and here, of course, we're focusing on anthropology, it really matters who is doing what. That's what we want to keep track of as anthropologists. We want to know who the actors are, how they're engaging with one another, what the products of their actions and engagements and practices are. That's what we do, right? So that you can imagine if we think back to Malinowski writing about the Trobriand Islanders building their vessels and making their long oceanic voyages from island to island to engage in the Kula trade, that if he wrote things in the passive voice, it would be a disaster. We wouldn't know who was doing what. We wouldn't know why it was important that this particular necklace was exchanged for this particular arm bracelet, right? So you have to write in the active voice in order to communicate who the actors are. Now, the way that you formulate the passive voice, you can see it in the sentence here, is you use the verb to be, and then you remove the subject of the sentence, and you use the past participle of the verb. So hit is the past participle. So Red was hit. That's the construction of the passive voice here. And you can see Red is the object in the sentence, but he is not the subject of the sentence. We don't have a subject in this sentence. That's the problem. So avoid that if you can. Also, it's just wordier, right? There are just more words in a sentence like that. And very often writing more economically is a kinder thing to do for your reader. It gets your points across more crisply, and there's less sort of mental gymnastics that your reader needs to do to figure out what it is that's going on. Okay, so that's the first thing, passive voice. There we go. Let me pause there. Any questions about that, or do you feel like you've got a sense of what I'm talking about here?
Yeah, we get the idea.
Very good, thank you. Next, sentence fragments. So a sentence fragment is something that comes up a lot. And I think maybe it comes up more now because texting is so pervasive and a lot of texting occurs in sentence fragments. So a lot of people who grew up with texting, as I did not, right? Mobile phones didn't exist when I was a kid. And so people become just habituated to using sentence fragments. So what is a sentence fragment? Well, as I say here, it's a collection of words masquerading as a sentence. It might have the appearance of a sentence, but it's not a sentence. Sometimes that's because there's no verb. Sometimes it's because there's no subject. And sometimes it's what's called a subordinate clause. I'll explain what I'm talking about there. Presented on its own as if it's its own sentence. So presented without the rest of the sentence. Okay, so what does this stuff look like in practice? To go back to the example that I was just talking about, the ball hit his head. His head. Okay, so the ball hit his head, sentence, perfectly fine. The second part, his head, sentence fragment. Why? Because there's no verb there, so it's a sentence fragment. Second one, the ball hit his head, bounced off. Okay, here again, we can see we have a verb now, but we have no subject. So it's a bounced off is a sentence fragment. Third, the ball bounced off his head, which was bruised. Which was bruised is an example of a subordinate clause, right? So there should be a comma after head, and then which was bruised should just be part of the whole sentence rather than a sentence on its own. And here we have a poor guy getting hit in the head with a tennis ball. All right, run-on sentences are the opposite kind of thing. And comma splices I put in here as well, because comma splices are a particular kind of run-on sentence. They're probably most run-on sentences involve comma splices. So I thought I would just deal with them both at once. Okay. What is a comma splice then? Let's start there. It's an example where a comma appears in the place of a period. So that you've reached the end of a sentence, you should have a period there, but instead there's a comma and it continues through to the next clause with as if it's all one sentence. So that's a run-on sentence. We can take an example here. The comma splice is the most common form of run-on sentence. In that case, a comma appears where there should be a period. So you can see in the example, which should have the end of a quotation mark at the end of it, my mistake there. Oh, that's okay, Michael. Yes, welcome. Don't worry, that's fine. Okay, so you can see in the second example where the comma occurs after sentence, that should be a period, and then it should be capital I for in. In that case, a comma appears where there should be a period. That's two perfectly good sentences instead of one run-on sentence created by a comma splice. Okay, so now we get to the next one. Run-on sentences that are not comma splices. So this is just a broader category of the same kind of thing. It's a matter then of running two independent clauses, right? So what we see in the examples above are two independent clauses. That is, they can stand on their own as sentences, right? They're not subordinate clauses that need a larger sentence to sort of house them. Then you have two independent clauses that are kind of run together. And typically, you can fix that with proper punctuation and the addition of a conjunction, a word like and or but or nor. So you can imagine then in the first case, if I were to say the comma splice is the most common form of run-on sentence, comma, and in that case, a comma appears where there should be a period, then you can see, okay, yeah, that's a perfectly good sentence, right? Because we added the word and, it's fine, it works. So you can see then there are different ways of generating run-on sentences. In either way, in either case, they're not grammatically correct, and they become a problem for your reader because then your reader has to pause, go back, read again, figure out where the problem was, and then figure out what it is that you're trying to communicate. And all of that interrupts the flow of your writing. What you want from a reader is for that reader, that would be me in this case, to read effortlessly, to feel as if there's no labor involved in the reading, because I'm just swept along by your words. I'm getting what you're talking about, and it feels completely straightforward. That's what we want. Run-on sentences get in the way of that. So do sentence fragments. They get in the way of that. They force me to stop and go back, reread, try and figure out what's going on. And then once I've got a handle on what I think is going on, then I can start reading again. But it's totally pulled me out of your paper by that point. So that's why it's better to avoid them. Now, I'm going to get to proofreading in just a moment. But one of the things you'll notice when you're proofreading your paper is that as you're reading a sentence, if you find that you sort of run out of breath reading it, then you probably have a run-on sentence. And even if you don't, it's probably a good idea to go back and see if there's a place where you can break a very long sentence into a couple or three shorter sentences. It's just easier for your reader to follow if you can do that. You don't have to have every sentence be a short sentence. It's nice to have a variation in the length of your sentence. It reads more nicely that way. But, you know, the main thing is try, if you can, to avoid very long sentences, even if they're not run-on sentences, because it will mean, if you have a very long sentence, that your reader gets to the end of the sentence and then it's like, wait, where did this begin again? And then I've got to go back and reread the sentence again to get the whole thing in one mouthful. And that's not ideal. Okay, so then on to proofreading. First, obviously, do it, right? You're turning in work that is not for your eyes only. And so what you sort of owe it to yourself to do, as much as you owe it to me, is to give it a read through yourself and make sure that, as far as you can tell, you're saying the things that you mean to say, not saying things you don't mean to say, and that it follows, right? That it's coherent, that it makes sense, that when you get to the end of the paper, every step along the way has helped bring the reader to that point and to the conclusion that you're trying to arrive at yourself. So first order of business, then, proofread your own paper. But there's a problem with proofreading your own work. You have to do it. But the problem that you run into, that everybody runs into, is that when you're reading your own work, there's a tendency to see on the page what you expect to be there. Of course, you wrote the thing, so you know what you're trying to say. And that means that it's very easy to skip over things that are not actually what you mean to say, not actually what you have in your head, so that what you mean to say and what's on the page don't line up with each other. And to solve that problem, you can just get someone else to read it for you. Now, there are some problems with this as well. One problem is you're asking someone to do you a favor, right? This is work that somebody else is going to do. So it has to be somebody who cares about you enough to give up that time to do it. But that person has to care about you in a way that he or she, they are willing to be honest with you, right? You can't have somebody who cares about your feelings so much that that person is afraid of hurting your feelings by pointing out things that don't make sense or that aren't clear or that aren't going quite right. You need somebody who's going to be kind of blunt with you. And so that's the balance you need to strike. But the advantage of having someone else read it is that person doesn't know ahead of time what it is you're trying to say. And so the places that don't make sense, or the places that are not nicely written, or the places where you get run-on sentences and things like that, that person will be able to recognize those things in a way that it's much harder for the writer to recognize. So that's my second piece of advice on proofreading. If possible, get someone else to read it, and get them to read it far enough ahead of time that you'll have the opportunity to incorporate any revisions that you need to incorporate after this person has given you feedback. Okay, but sometimes you don't have someone on hand who can do that work for you. And so one possible solution for this, a solution that's better than reading it quietly to yourself, is to read your paper out loud to yourself. Now, I've done this, and certainly it brings things out, right? You notice things when you read out loud that you don't notice when you're just reading inside your own head. As you're reading, if, as I was saying in the previous slide, you find that you're running out of air, then that's a sign that your sentence is very long and maybe needs some more punctuation in there somewhere to make it a more manageable sentence. If you're reading out loud and what you hear doesn't sound quite right, well, if it doesn't sound right to you, it's definitely not going to sound right to someone else reading your paper. And so then you have to do something about that. You need to revise it. Maybe you need to break some sentences up to make shorter sentences that will hold together better. Maybe you just have a passage that's not very clear, and you'll be able to recognize it and go back and think, okay, what do I need to do to make my point here clearer? It's hard, at least for me. I don't know, maybe the rest of you are not as self-conscious as I am, but I find if I use this technique that I feel self-conscious reading something out loud if there are other people around. And so it's not ideal, but it does work. And so it's a solution if you can't find someone else to do it. So just try and find a quiet place where other people can't hear you if it's something that makes you feel self-conscious. Okay, so that's the end of that. Now, next thing, on to your notes. So this, I've already got something up on YouTube about this. So a couple of you have watched it. So I'm going through basically the same thing here, but I wanted to give you some sort of, I guess, advice on how to handle your notes. And that's why I extended the due date until Thursday for your interview notes, so that if there's something in here that is helpful to you, that gives you a chance to go back and revise your notes before then, you have this opportunity to do it. All right, so now, the most important thing is that these notes, the notes that you develop from your interview, they're the main resource, the main evidence, the main source of insights for writing your paper. And so the thing that notes have to do is they need to serve your purposes. The better the notes will serve your purposes then, as a source of insight, as a source of information, then the better grade they'll earn. So that if I were to get a set of notes that looked to me exactly like the kind of notes that you scribbled down madly during an interview, then that's not going to be a great set of notes. It's not going to get a very good grade. Why? Because it's not going to serve you well when you're writing up your paper. And so what do you need to do? You need to make your notes richer, more detailed, and more vivid. That will allow them to work as a kind of memory cue for you when you're writing your final paper, but they'll also give you some of the richness of detail that you'll be able to just transport directly into your paper. And so you're actually already doing some of the work for your final paper when you write up your notes more formally. The work then starts with what you jot down during the interview. From the article that I gave you by Mary Gatta, she calls these jottings. And those things, those are just quick point form notes. Your students, you've listened to lectures, you're listening to a lecture right now. Maybe some of you are taking notes on it. You know what it is to take notes then when somebody's talking, right? This is not a brand new skill that you need to develop or anything like that. And so you know what I'm talking about here, that when you're listening to somebody talk, you cannot get down every single word that that person says. And so you jot things down as quickly as you can that are going to serve you to prompt your memory later on. That's all jottings are. They're memory cues for later on. Later on then is when you write up the proper notes, right? That's when you take all the memory cues and you put them into full sentences and full paragraphs, rich in detail, rich in insights. That's the transition from jottings to the kind of notes that I'm asking you to produce for your second assignment. So if the jottings are something like a sketch, right? Something that will just serve as the sort of the basic underlying structure of what you're going to do later. The description you create is something like filling in the details that the sketch leaves out, right? So that you begin with a sketch and then you turn it later into the richer, detailed, full color picture, if you will, that your final notes will be. There are two kinds of things that you do, skills that you try to develop as you're writing up these notes. Two things that the notes have to provide. One is description, the other is reflection. So your notes should be descriptive. You have to then give yourself an accurate, richly detailed account of the interview. So that's going to mean not just what each of you said, but whatever other details about the interview setting, the way that your interviewee acted, the way that your interviewee responded, say through body language, all of these things will go into your description. But then they also have, the notes also have to be reflective. That is, including the thoughts and ideas that the interview brought to your mind, the sort of spontaneous things that occur to you. And maybe they're just points of association, things that the interviewee says at the beginning of the interview and then somewhere later on that allow you to make a connection that you hadn't expected to make. That could be. Maybe it's an association you make with something that you've read. And then you can see how a concept that you read about in one of the course readings sheds some light on what the interviewee just said, or gives you a way of thinking about it that will let you make better sense of it later on. Or maybe it's that a question popped into your head as a result of something that your interviewee just said. And so that altered the course of the conversation in some way. All of these things go into your notes. But this can also happen, of course, while you're writing up your notes. While you're writing the proper notes, you have the opportunity to reflect on what you heard, what you said to one another, what your interaction was like. And that's a point where you can insert your reflections that occur to you during the process of writing up the notes as well. So both descriptive and reflective then. But you have to keep a couple of things in mind beyond that. You want to keep attention on your research question. This is going to become important again later on. And second, you want to get a clear sense of the world from your interviewee's perspective. That's the thing that we're trying to learn about. What does the world look like to my interviewee? What's important to my interviewee? What explains my interviewees' actions, decisions, priorities in life, likes, dislikes, whatever the case may be, whatever's relevant. That's the other thing. So one of the reasons that it's not particularly helpful just to get a verbatim, word for word transcript of what each of you said in the interview is that it doesn't allow you to strike this balance between your research interests and the say the priority that your interviewee is placing on things. So getting exact quotes can help you with this second point, getting the picture of the world that your interviewee has. Get exact quotes where it's helpful. So, okay, what does that mean to say where it's helpful? Well, where it's helpful is going to be defined in large part by your agenda, right? So helpful is defined in terms of your project. And the reason then that you don't want to just reproduce a transcript, but rather select the things that you put in direct quotes and leave to summarize a summarization the things that you don't want to quote directly, is that allows the things that really struck you as important, as something that your interviewee said maybe that was unexpected, that really caught your attention, or that seemed really important to your interviewee, and so you wanted to get exactly the way that your interviewee put it. You want those things to stand out from the rest of the interview, and so that's why you directly quote them. The rest of it you can capture in a summary, including the way that your interviewee acted, behaved, what facial expressions your interviewee had, and so on, right? So that those things don't need that kind of precision in detail the way a quote does. And you want the quotes to stand out from the background. If everything is reproduced in a transcript, then nothing stands out because there is no background. It's all the same. So this is why I say quote the things that are most important, but summarize the rest. The descriptive dimension of your notes, then, you can sort of think about it like this. It includes the who part of your interview, who it is, who you interviewed. And then you just include whatever details are relevant for the purposes of your notes, right? So that when you go back to read them or when someone else reads them, like me, you'll be able to give a kind of a snapshot of who that person is. Then the what. So what happened, what your interviewee said. Third thing is the how your interviewee sees things that you ask about. Those are the main three. The other two, the where and when, are not necessarily going to be as important. They might be in some cases. And so you, on those occasions where you find out that the setting or the timing of the interview are particularly important for understanding what went on in the interview, then sure, you should include those things in your notes as well. But on the whole, the priority will go to the who, what, and how questions, and that will make up your descriptive content. The reflective content, on the other hand, as I was saying before, that includes all of these ideas, impressions, thoughts, and maybe even criticisms or disagreements that arose for you during the interview, all of that stuff that you observed and heard during the interview. You might also have unanswered questions. As I say, sometimes what happens is as you're writing up your notes, a question occurs to you that didn't occur to you at the time, and you don't have the opportunity to ask that question right then. Maybe you email your interviewee with a follow-up to say, hey, I thought of this afterward. What do you think? That's fine. That's a good way of getting information. But keep track of it in your notes, right? Keep that in your notes. It might be an association that produces something interesting for you later on. And then also include insights that came to you during the interview or while writing up the notes. Again, this is the whole point of doing the interview, is to gain insight into the world as it appears to your interviewee. And so sometimes you're going to get a kind of spark that brings you clarity about what your interviewee is telling you. Take note of that kind of thing. And so these are the ways I think that you can produce notes that are going to be productive for you when you go to write your paper. And as I say, writing them up in this way will actually get a certain amount of the writing done for your paper, because you're not going to be able to cut and paste your entire interview notes into your paper. You're going to be selective, but there might be sections that you can just cut and paste directly from your notes into your paper, especially where there are quotations. So it's not work that's done just to satisfy an assignment. It's also work that is going to set you up for your final paper. All right, now you've done your research, your interviews. It's time to start turning to the essay. And so at this point, you've gathered some information, you've generated a certain set of insights from the interview, from the research, and so it's time to put it into essay form. As I say, it's possible that not everything you gather from the research is going to make it into the final paper. So your first task is to think about how the interview informed you on your research, on your question, excuse me, and which part of the interview you develop in a clear and well-supported thesis. So when I say that not everything is going to make it in, I'll give you an example from my own research. Do I have? Right. So this is, oops. This is the book that's the product of my first major research. So as you see from the title, it's on human rights in Thailand. The research that I was doing was in 2004 and 2005. And you may or may not know this, but there was a fantastic earthquake, fantastic not in a good sense, but in the sense of being large, off the Andaman coast, that produced an enormous tsunami that just devastated a whole lot of the Andaman coast of Thailand, of Aceh province in Indonesia, of the southern and eastern coast of Sri Lanka, and a number of other places. But Thailand and Indonesia were especially hard hit. And so while I was doing this research on human rights, I accompanied a group of lawyers who were going down to southern Thailand, to the Andaman region, because there were many Burmese migrant workers who lived in that area. Now, the history, I think I might have mentioned this in the past already, but the history of Thailand and Burma, or the kingdoms that became Thailand and Burma, so the kingdom of Siam and different Burmese kingdoms through the past, they have a long history of warfare with one another. So in Thailand, Burmese people generally are not very highly regarded. And so they already have kind of a bad relationship with law enforcement there. And they're worried, many of them anyway, are worried that if they get arrested, the Thai police will take them to the border, hand them over to the Burmese border police, and that the Burmese border police or the Thai border police will sell them into human trafficking rings. That's what they're worried about. And so they're very, very apprehensive about engaging with the police. After the tsunami, I promise this is all going to make sense in a moment. After the tsunami, there were, of course, many people who were drowned and whose bodies were they needed to be identified. A lot of them were tourists because this is a very popular tourist destination in that part of Thailand. And so the police set up a DNA, well, they didn't set it up, but they wound up running a DNA testing facility so that people who had family in Thailand at the time could come give just a cheek swab to get a DNA sample, and then they could test that against the DNA that they collect from the people who had been killed, whose bodies they had recovered. Burmese people, of course, they also lost family in the tsunami, and yet, but they didn't want to have anything to do with this DNA testing program. And so, because it was run by the police and they were nervous about the police. So that's what the lawyers were down there to do, is to set up this kind of parallel DNA testing facility, not run by the police, in coordination with some Burmese NGOs in the area, so that Burmese people could try and also locate their lost family members. In the process of doing this, because the lawyers were in direct contact with Burmese NGOs, they also learned of this fellow who is a Burmese migrant worker. He had been working on restoration after the damage from the tsunami of the facade of a school building. And scaffolding there is largely made up of bamboo and twine, right? So it's not the most robust stuff here. It's not like if you walk around virtually anywhere in Manhattan, you're going to see scaffolding and, you know, it's all steel and solid boards and stuff. It's not like that. So this guy had fallen, he'd landed on his head, he was in the hospital in a coma, and things looked genuinely bleak for him because, of course, he had no money. He had nobody who had money around him who was going to be able to maintain the hospital care for him. And so a friend, a fellow worker, had gotten in touch with one of these NGOs to see if they could do anything. They knew the lawyers, so they got in touch with the lawyers to see if they could do anything. And indeed, eventually the lawyers managed to persuade, let's say, the business owner of the construction company to cover this guy's hospital bills. Now, that to me was a fantastically interesting anecdote from my fieldwork, but I could never figure out where it would fit in my final project. So it's not in my book because it never had a place where it made sense to bring that up. Happily, I can bring it up in lectures, so it's not a complete loss. But this is what I mean, that you have to be selective about the information and the insight you've gathered from your research. Not everything can go in. You need to keep what goes in relevant to what your research question is. If it doesn't help answer the question, it doesn't really belong in the paper. So, okay, so that was a long walk to get to that particular conclusion, but that's the point that I wanted to make with this. All right. So now you've worked out what your interview is telling you, right? Like you figured out this is what my interview is teaching me about this person's world. Now you're in a position to think about how your thesis engages with existing scholarship, right? Because it never just stands alone. Your research never just stands alone. It's always in conversation with other scholars who have done work on similar projects. They haven't done your project, but they've done projects that are similar in a way that they can engage in conversation with each other. So you want to figure out, does that scholarship give you concepts that clarify your research findings? And if they do, what are they and how do they help? this should be part of your paper. You should be able to include that kind of insight. You don't have to go on at great length about it, but you want to acknowledge how you borrow concepts from others, because we all do that all the time, while you're putting together the argument that you're presenting in your paper. But further, just because you gather concepts from the scholarship doesn't mean that you're necessarily in agreement with what other scholars have to say. Your work might in some way be at odds with what other scholars say. If so, that's interesting, right? That means that that is a particular way that your work expands the body of knowledge that we have at our disposal. You are able to illuminate something that previous scholars have not yet illuminated. That's great. But also, it might be that your work does line up in a clear, important way with other scholarship. That's also an important thing to note, right? Because that helps us gain a greater sense of certainty about how the world is. So either way, you want to be able to acknowledge how your project is in conversation with other scholars, and the way that you borrow concepts, maybe enhance those concepts, maybe make them more robust through that exchange. All right, now, last section, how to structure your essay. So because things make more sense to me when they're visual, I've put this together in this particular way. I hope this is also helpful for you. So you start off with your introduction. You're going in your introduction from broad to narrow. The broad part is the broad topic that you're talking about, right? So if you go back to my book, you think human rights in Thailand, that is a very broad topic, right? It needs some narrowing down. And so through the introduction, you narrow it down by identifying the particular themes that you're going to highlight within that topic in order to make the particular claims that you're going to make. So to go back to my project, some of the themes that were important for my work were the relationship between Buddhism and human rights advocacy. Another theme that was important was the history of democratic struggle in Thailand and the way that that produced certain kinds of political movements that eventually channeled their energy into advocacy for human rights. So that's a theme under the broad topic of human rights in Thailand. And then you get down to your thesis. So for your thesis, you want a sentence that begins with something like, this paper argues that, or in this paper, I argue that, or I'm making the case that, and then whatever it is that you're arguing, or whatever your thesis is, or whatever case you're making, that finishes the sentence. So that should be the bottom tip of this triangle that I put here, where you state your thesis in a single sentence. This is what this paper is arguing. So then you get into the body of your paper, and through the body of your paper, you're going to be elaborating on each of the themes that you raised in the introduction, right? So you don't want to raise things in the body of the paper that don't appear in your introduction. You want to let your reader know in your introduction sort of what the terrain of your paper is going to be. You're giving me, as the reader, a roadmap so that as I make my way through the body of your paper, when you raise the different themes, I already know that they're coming up. So I'm oriented to the kinds of things that you're going to tell me through the body of your paper. And this is where you are laying out all of the information that you've gathered and the insights that you've developed through the research that you've done, right? This is where you present all of that. And so you want to lay it out in a way that makes sense so that the evidence is clearly tied to some aspect of the argument that you're making. So to go back to the example of my book, I don't want to start raising issues about democratic struggle in the middle of my discussion of Buddhism and human rights. That's just going to make things confusing for the reader. They're not going to know what I'm talking about. Am I talking about political movements, or am I talking about the way that people marshal a specific version of Buddhism to defend human rights? I want to keep these things separate so that I'm dealing with them sort of one at a time. It's clear to my reader what it is that I'm addressing right now. And then that's a certain puzzle piece in the overall argument that I'm making. Now, your paper is a short paper. I'm not asking you to write long papers on this. So each section for you might just be a single paragraph. You might not even need to use headings in your paper to identify the different sections in the body of your paper as you go through it. That's fine. Maybe some of your sections are going to be longer. Maybe some of the things will take 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs to get through. If you do that, I would suggest use headings in the paper so that I, your reader, know exactly what that section is, where it begins, where it ends, and the work that it's trying to do before you move to the next section. But as I say, if a particular section dealing with a particular theme is 1 paragraph long, and that's the case for all of the body of your essay, that's perfectly fine too. This is not, you're not writing a thesis here. This is just a short paper on a very limited amount of research. So, so that would work just fine as well. Okay, finally, then we get to the conclusion. Here, to begin with, you restate your thesis. You want to put, again, in a clear single sentence, in this paper, I have demonstrated that, and then whatever it is that you've demonstrated. Why? Because you want to cue your reader back in to what it is that I should have learned, the conclusion I should have come to, the thing that I should be persuaded about through the reading of this paper. And then you can open it to broader, to the broader implications. So if there are things that you haven't argued in the paper, but that are there by implication. So that I've argued in my book about how Buddhism and political movements and some other things as well have contributed to the emergence of human rights in Thailand. And so what are the broader implications of this? Well, the kinds of things that I pointed to that, again, were not part of my research. I didn't argue them in the book, but what I found in the book leads me toward these things is that the way that Thai people engage with, promote, maintain, or lose human rights has a lot to do with their, or will have a lot to do with their receptiveness toward things like democratic governance. Sadly, they haven't gotten to enjoy much of that since I wrote the book. There's no causal connection there. It's going to have a lot to do with how willing they are to embrace a particular egalitarian model of Buddhism, which is not the mainstream model of Buddhism in Thailand. And so these are things that are for the future, but that the future of human rights in Thailand would have to do with these sorts of things. And so I'm gesturing toward those things, even though I'm not arguing about what they're necessarily going to look like, because they're things for the future. All right, now that is that. So let me first turn on my light. All right, there we go. So at this point, I just want to turn the class over to the rest of you to take your questions I'm sure that the prospect of writing the final paper is a cause for a certain amount of stress among some of you. And so at this point, I want to know what your questions are. If you had any questions about anything that I just said, I want to answer those. So, what are your questions?
Okay, my question is, in our final essay, we're using the interview and we're using the research
Yes.
for connecting the paragraph and make it as a one
That,
essay.
yeah, that's right. So the final paper is based on your interview. That's your research, is your interview. And so you will put the things that you've learned from your interview into
Mhm.
conversation with whatever sources you're
I
drawing on,
use.
whichever scholarly sources, but mostly it's about the material you gathered from your interview. Oh, and I shouldn't forget to say this. In the final paper, you have to, when you draw on one of the scholarly sources, you have to cite it properly. That means that you need to include a separate page with your list of works cited. For most of you, that list is going to include just one item because you're only going to refer to one source, but you have to include that. And so I put on the syllabus a link to a fantastic website called the Purdue Owl, and it will explain citation to you. It will explain how to put together a bibliography or a list of works cited properly. So you can go and look at that to figure out how to do it. But also, if you have questions about it, let me know. Fire me an
How
email.
many,
Yes.
how many words?
Hang on, that I need to look at the syllabus. I think I said something like 900 words.
Oh,
Um,
that's not a lot.
it's not a lot, no.
Not a lot.
700 to 900 words. So
Oh,
you're looking at like 2 pages is going to be a little bit on the short side, but 2 full pages would be
yeah.
okay. It would be a bit short, but okay. On the long side, I think if you've written 5 pages, you've done more than the assignment requires. I'm not going to tell you not to write 5 pages. If that's the amount of writing that you need in order to make the argument that you want to make or to develop the thesis that you want to develop, take all the space that you need. That's fine with me. But if you're thinking about what my expectations are, my expectations are like around 3 pages, three and a half, something like that. So it's a short essay, right? I'm not asking you to do a long piece of writing here.
It's a sure.
All right, what other questions do you have?
There's a question in the comments.
Oh yeah, in the comments, yes. So Nicholas, so is the final paper more personal to the person we interviewed? I think I need you to explain what you mean by that.
I kind of mean like when you're writing about the topic, do you just refer to the interview to write about a more broad sense of, what the idea of what you're writing about?
Yeah, okay.
Or
So I think I've got a handle on your question. Tell me if I'm not getting it right though, because I want to make sure that I answer your
yeah,
question
yeah.
properly. So what you were doing with the interview is going to someone who had some relevant life experience or insight or knowledge about the question that you're trying to answer.
Yes.
Right? So the interview gathers that information and allows you to develop those insights. So in the final paper, you're taking what you've gotten from the interview and you're just organizing it in a way to present that information as a way of explaining how you answered your research question. The way that you answer your research question, that's what your thesis is, right? So if your thesis is, no, that's the wrong way to go about it. Here, I'll take this as an example that is like completely disconnected from the course. So hopefully it will be illuminating without being too leading. So if my research question is something about the weather, so I want to know if it's raining outside or not, then I develop a method to find that out. I know somebody who has a window, right? So I interview that person, I get that person to look out the window, tell me if it's raining. For some reason in my scenario, I don't have windows. I don't know why that is, but just work with me on this. Okay, so then through that interview, I gather the information, and then in my paper, my write-up, I'm developing my thesis. I'm saying my argument is that it is raining outside. And then I explain how I gathered that information, what that information was, and present that as an argument. So then what I'm elaborating on through the paper is what I gathered from my interviewee, right? As I say, I'm not going to necessarily put down everything that my interviewee said, because not everything is going to be helpful in answering my question, but hopefully most of it is. So then it's just about organizing the information that I gathered in a way that I can present a clear argument. Okay, so let me stop talking for a moment and ask you, Nicholas, so does that respond to your question?
If I understand it right, so you're basically saying that the interview further pushes your initial question, and the initial question is what's mainly talked about throughout the entire essay?
Yeah, your essay is the answer to your research question,
Okay.
right? So you
Okay.
had a question, you went and did some research. Your paper is the answer to that, the answer
Okay,
that
so
you developed.
you would use the interview as answers as well as other background sources.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. How about your hand has been up for like 45 minutes now. I did see it. Now, go ahead. What's your question?
It's fine, Professor. I was kind of also wondering how if there was a specific way you wanted us to write in our essay about like the interview. Do you want us to write in the like directly in the interview, or the person I interviewed like that, or is there a certain, or we shouldn't write it like that? You want us to write it in a different way?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. So, when you're talking about your interview, so first thing, when you're talking about your interviewee, you should come up with an alias for your interviewee. So then you can say, so let's say I've interviewed Heba, but I want to make sure that my interviewee's identity is that I maintain anonymity for my interviewee. So I'll come up with another name, and the name will be picked out of nowhere in particular, Boone. Okay, Boone is now going to be the alias that I use. So I will recount the interview that I had with Boone, sometimes quoting directly. And so I'll say, when I asked Boone such and such question, the response was, and then I open my quotation marks, I write the quotation, and I close the quotation marks. And that's it. There's no citation there, right? Because you're not citing another source, you're citing your own interview. So you don't need to add a citation for that. There's no other source for it. So then I might go on to summarize whatever else Boone has told me that doesn't need to be directly quoted, but that I think is an important addition or an important elaboration on what I've just said. So I'll just summarize in my own words what Boone has said at that point. So that's the way that I would draw in what the interviewee has said to me, both using direct quotations and using my own words to summarize what my interviewee has said, or where I think that it's important to capture the way that my interviewee responded. If I ask a question and my interviewee grimaced before answering, that might be something that brings the paper to life in a way that makes it more vivid to explain, rather than just giving the words. Also give the person's response to my questions, or if they shift uncomfortably in the seat, to take note of that and to bring it in so that, so that there's some sense that this is not just like a word generator saying things, that this is a human being responding in a particular way to the things that we're talking about. And those responses can be as interesting and important as the words that come out of the person's mouth. So okay, let me pause again. Does that help you with the question that you asked?
Yes, thank you, Professor.
Fantastic. All right, what else? What other questions?
Wait, also, I'm sorry. The writing resources, what is, I'm confused. What is that for this essay?
Yes.
It
Yeah.
says like the hacker citation. So we use that to write our, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, and those, the way that you bring in the other source or other sources, if you decide you want to use more than one, can be very brief, right? Like you don't need to go into a long elaboration about what the scholarly source has said on the topic. You can just very quickly bring in something like, okay, so let's say, so religion is something that has come up in a lot of your proposals. So let's say you're referring to Lambeck's work. So you might want to make the point that, as Lambeck points out, we should think about religion not just in terms of what people believe, but also what they practice. And then you would put the citation for Lambeck and move on, right? So that's the way to do it. You don't need to make a big elaboration on what Lambeck has said. You just need to point out he's given you a particular kind of concept, the concept that religion is about practice as well as belief. And so there, you've done it in this very efficient, economical way. And you've stuck to the point that you want to make, that Lambeck helps you make, without getting distracted by a long journey through Lambeck's work, because you want to keep your eye on your own research, not on someone else's. Is that clear what I'm saying? Like, is there anybody who hears me say that and is not quite clear on what I'm saying?
No, it makes sense, Professor.
Super. Okay. What's the next question?
In regards to the interview, would you like that to be its own individual paragraph, or would you want it to be kind of like sprinkled throughout the sub claims that we have for the question?
Oh, that is a super question as well. Okay. Yeah, oh, you're coming up with great questions, Dan. I'm very pleased by this. Okay. So probably you're going to sprinkle it through the entire paper, because you're going to have several points that you want to make. Maybe you're going to have 2 or 3 main points that you want to make through the paper, and that's it. And that would be fine. That's about the right number for a short paper like this. So then for each point that you want to make, you want to draw something from the interviews to support that point. So that in that way, you're going to distribute what you learned from the interview through the entire paper in support of each point as you come to it. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Super. Okay, good. That's great. You're asking really smart questions. These are exactly the things it's important to have clear. So this is very good. What other questions do you have, or what other things are leaving you uncertain about how to proceed?
We also work with works cited. How should we go about citing our interview, or should we cite our interview in the first place?
Also a superb question. Do not cite your interview. Other people in the future are going to read your work and they will cite your work, but your interview is your research. So you're presenting your research, and so you don't need to cite it because it's your research. So citations are for acknowledging work that someone else has done. Acknowledging, like, in this moment, I'm drawing on Lambeck's work. So I'm citing him, giving him credit for helping me make the point that I'm making. The interview is that's you. So you present it rather than citing it as if it were from someone else.
Okay, so what I'm planning on doing, like from hearing that, is I'm thinking that I should introduce the like stating that I conducted an interview in the introduction, so it
Perfect.
doesn't seem out of place when it's like throughout the claims, right?
Absolutely perfect. Yes. Yes,
Okay.
that's a fantastic idea. I encourage everyone who just heard that, I encourage you all to do exactly that. Other questions, other concerns?
I just had one question.
Go ahead.
When is our last meeting?
Next week.
Okay, thank you
So
so much. I'm sorry.
so my plan for next week is unless
I'm sorry, go.
let me back up and say this in a clear way. I was about to say it in the muddiest possible way. That's not helping anybody. If I get questions from you by email between now and next week, I might put together like a short presentation like I did today to deal with those questions. If they seem like they're questions that are going to be relevant to a large number of you. If not, then what I'll do is I'll open the Zoom meeting, and it will be just an open conversation like what we're having here, because you're going to be at a different place in your writing process. Then you're going to be in the midst of writing your paper, and things will have come up for you between now and then. So I wanted to reserve that class just for you to get my input on how to work out whatever kind of thing is presenting a problem for you. And so just to have this kind of open discussion of it as we're doing right now.
Thank you so much. Perfect.
No trouble at all. All right, I'm probably going to repeat this again next week as well, because I tend to do that. But it seems like there are no other questions. So I just want to give you very quickly a sense of why I've designed the class the way that I have and the kind of arc that I had in mind with the class. So what I wanted from it was I wanted you to have the opportunity to do your own original research on a very small scale, it's true, but I wanted you to get a feeling for what it's like to do your own original first person kind of ethnographic research. And So with that goal in mind, I was thinking sort of backwards, what are the steps that I need to work through to get you to the position where you're ready to go out and interview somebody about a topic of your choosing and then write about that. And so that's why we started with some research by anthropologists to kind of get the sense of the sort of thing that interests anthropologists and how anthropologists have gone about thinking about those sorts of things. Then moving to how it is to conceive of a project, right? Like starting with a question. What's the question that I want to answer? How do I want to go about answering the question? Which was the proposal section. Then going through the process of actually gathering the information, doing that first person research, so that by this point in the semester, you've gathered all of that and you're prepared to start writing. So that's been kind of the arc that I imagined for the course. I don't know if that's helpful for you in terms of thinking about like the role that the paper plays in the course overall, but that's sort of where I was headed with it. And the like I wanted to give you an opportunity to do something that looks a bit like anthropology instead of just reading what a lot of other people have thought anthropology is like. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, but anyway, that's the way that I was conceiving of it. Hopefully that makes it a little bit more obvious why I'm winding up with this kind of project and the kind of thing that I'm expecting from this project.